I'm Christopher Wilkins, Music Director and Conductor of the Akron Symphony. This is my 16th season as Music Director with the orchestra.
My name is Gunnar Walsh. I'm the co-composer as well as a soloist for Confluence Concerto for EarthQuaker Devices and Orchestra.
My name's John Sonnenberg, and I'm the co-composer for the Confluence piece.
So we're talking about what we call the EarthQuaker Symphony. It's a collaboration between EarthQuaker and the Akron Symphony. There's a million reasons why we should be working together. First of all, EarthQuaker has a huge presence locally, but also it's a well-known company internationally, is really, I think, a wonderful Akron success story in that it's an innovator, and Akron is known for that. It's a manufacturer, and Akron is known for that. And it's a cultural leader. And we're just very aware of the impact that EarthQuaker has had. So we went to Julie and said, what would be the best way to represent what your company does in a collaboration with the symphony? And she recommended the composer, performer, innovator, electrical engineer, John Sonnenberg, longtime EarthQuaker artist, as somebody who could think creatively about how to translate his work using the pedals into our world. And then conversely, I had to think about a composer who is adept at writing for orchestras, but who has enough experience with pedals that he could translate that into our world. And so the key people really are the two composers, John Sonnenberg and Gunnar Walsh. And in fact, the way they've organized the piece now, they are also the two soloists. They are the two guest artists. So they'll be on stage with us performing this thing that they've co-created called Confluence.
So I was approached in January of 2020 by Chris Wilkins, who I had worked with a couple of times before in Boston with his orchestra there. He's an oboist as well, and I'm an oboist composer. He's an oboist conductor. And so I think we really see eye to eye and ear to ear, so to speak, and have really similar ways of thinking about music and thinking about orchestration and the role that an orchestra can play in musical storytelling. He had said, Jake, I am in the works with another composer, John Sonnenberg, as well as the folks at EarthQuaker Devices to create this piece for orchestra, electronics, sort of an invented instrument, and, are you on board? To which I, of course, said yes.
It sounded really amazing, like such a great opportunity. So I started talking to Chris Wilkins about it.
Meanwhile, John, on his end, was mining his vast trove of works that he'd written for his solo acts or for film, to think about past work that he had done that he could share with Jake that might be a starting point for their discussions about how this orchestral piece would take shape.
So for example, one of the pieces that I had written for a film was this piece, and it became one of the kind of basic themes that Confluence was written around. If you're writing for a video game, the music isn't the focus at all. People are interested in the video game. The music is something background. And so it's really just something that you want to be interesting enough, but not distracting. So it's something that kind of needs to be melodic, and maybe the person starts humming it when they aren't playing the video game, but it's not the main focus. If you do a movie soundtrack, again, you aren't the focus. You're supporting something else that's happening, and the audience is focused on this other thing. So classical music is a really unique environment where the audience is there to experience the music and the music only. That's a really exciting thing for me because it's a different way of writing. So what you just heard was the original film music that I had written. And then when I was making the outline of the same piece to hand over to Jake, it sounded like this. So again, I took a lot of these ideas and started writing them on the piano, and then just kind of filled in with some samples of different orchestral instruments. And those instruments became part of the outline that I handed over. Came down to one piece that I wrote that was about 13 minutes long. So basically I took pieces that I had already written, played them on a piano, and just kind of modulated and transposed into different keys until I was really comfortable with the transition that took these different parts into one kind of core idea. And then that was my outline. And then Jake, the other co-composer, got involved.
So I felt as though I was faced with a couple of challenges. The first challenge was, as co-composer with John Sonnenberg, to take his musical language, which is perhaps a little bit more free and mostly electronic based, and translate that for a symphony orchestra in which all of those instruments were still able to have their strengths really shine. We wanted to write an orchestra piece first and have the electronics enhance that, and I think we were successful in doing that. The second challenge, of course, was to figure out how we were even going to include EarthQuaker technology at all. We were running into issues of space. How were we going to mic certain instruments of the orchestra? We were faced with issues of amplitude and volume and feedback and all these different kinds of things. So I felt as though, as the co-composer and orchestrator, I was really picturing the orchestra and envisioning where people were on the stage and making it so that when we have our principal cellist mic'd playing through the effects pedals, the rest of the cello section that they're sitting with is silent. When we're having the principal violinist play, we're trying to have as little interference with that from the rest of the orchestra. So places in the orchestra where the sound couldn't possibly interfere.
One of the problems we're having is that the natural acoustical sound is overwhelming the effect. So it's counterintuitive, but it's often helpful if you're playing an effect, don't play too loud, because they can't get the effect on top of your live sound strong enough, if you know what I mean. So try that again, piano, mezzo piano, and see if we'll get a little more effect out of it. We had planned this before the pandemic hit, and when the pandemic came, we found that there were useful ways that we could prepare for what ultimately is happening virtually. And so we had 3 ASO musicians, Akron Symphony musicians, who went to EarthQuaker, experimented with some of the pedals, tried different kinds of effects through their instrument, tried different pieces of music, and together with your video team, created 3 really interesting videos that show a range of effects, a range of ways of using each effect, and a range of musical examples treated through the pedals. And that actually, I think, was a really useful place to start, as it turned out, because part of Jake's challenge was to figure out which pedal to use in which way with which instrument.
It was sort of like a, sound sandbox of just figuring out what instruments could do, or acoustic orchestral instruments could do with these pedals. So then from there, John and I had sort of developed an overall form and an overall arch for the piece. And then, it was mostly just as I would work, I would send things to John, he would send them back to me, and I would make some edits. Chris Wilkins was very involved in the process, and so we ran a lot of the information by him to just check in with what the orchestral musicians would be comfortable with. And then it was really just sort of this little triangle of writing and sending and sharing with John and sharing with Chris and sending it back to me, and then here we are.
While there have been orchestral pieces written for electronica and orchestra, I'm not aware of anything quite like this, where the electronics are built into the orchestra as well. In other words, we have about a half a dozen orchestra musicians who are not accustomed to playing into pedals, who will be playing through these effects and interacting with what Jake and John do. It's super exciting. Everyone is thrilled about this.
Today we're at E.J. Thomas Hall and we just finished our rehearsal for the Confluence performance tomorrow night. Let me show you some stuff. We wrote this piece with a lot of specific EarthQuaker effects in mind, and one of the things that I kept a conscious eye on is what does the orchestra instrument, what are its limitations, and how can we expand all of the like vibratos and things that are very static, stepped pitches, quantized pitches. How can we expand those and make them into something that they don't normally do? There are some distortions that I'm using, especially on some of the bass. Like the timpani is going through this dirt transmitter. I have the contrabass going through the terminal. A lot of these are just kind of reverb and ethereal effects. I have 3 afterneaths here, and I have a transmissor which I'm using on the cello, which I love, kind of sweeping this frequency and kind of these nice transitions of almost like a band pass filter moving around. I have 2 dispatch masters. One's on the piano, the other one's on the vibraphone. I have the French horn going through the space spiral, and then we have the astral destiny. The clarinet's going through that. And there's moments where I want just this grittiness out of the clarinet. And the data corruptor is a very chaotic pedal. There's only certain settings that I feel like it's really tame, but it works really well on the clarinet in this piece. Like the pitch isn't constant. Like if the clarinet's doing this ooh, it's like ooh, it's like there's this kind of drunkenness to it that I love in certain aspects. So it's just this great extension of the orchestra. I have 2 aqueducts, one set on a vibrato for the piccolo. A flute and piccolo usually just do like a tremolo, like the volume wavers, but I really wanted this tight vibrato. So I'm playing a lot with the depth and the rate on that. I also have one on the harp, and this one's set to more of like a square wave. So the pitch is a little more stepping between 2 different pitches rather than a sine wavy type of LFO. It just almost brings it to this like kind of warbly, ethereal space, and especially with the acoustics of this hall, it just, to me, it sounds like magic. This board, it's not like the orchestra's just playing through a constant level of effects. What happens is there's only certain effects that I'm turning off and on during the performance, and most of these effects are like the clarinet's going through 2 pedals, the contrabass is going through 2 pedals. So in some instances, I'm turning off the distortion and just having the flanger kind of stay there. On all the effects that are just single effects on the instruments, they're constantly on. And what I'm doing during the performance is I'm actually playing the levels. So as the piece is evolving, I'm actually moving these faders around. And then the score that I use, I cared more about where the instruments were happening rather than what notes they're playing in this case. So a lot of my score is just blocks the measure that is happening, the movement, and just like what instruments are happening when.
So the word is confluence, and that suggests this tremendous diversity of sound eventually forming a single stream. So coming from different places, different regions of the orchestra, different colors, different levels of distortion or vibrato or overdrive or whatever it is.
I think there's a lot of elements about this particular piece that confluence applies to. Two things coming together to make one. Even the idea of two co-composers coming together from different worlds and creating something.
As far as the orchestra piece is concerned, we have 6 movements total.
All of them, except the last one, are named after EarthQuaker devices. So particular effects essentially inspire the tone of each of the movements.
And then in the last movement, the first 5 movements have that. The last movement is the convergence of all of those at the same time. So we have material from the first movement that gets brought back in the second and third and so on. So we sort of have these different musical channels that all rejoin as the piece goes on.
But even the idea of confluence from this musical instrument idea that I had, you know, I've often thought about taking different modes of vibration and bringing them into one instrument. And so even the Confluence Harp was a great opportunity to build this instrument and try this idea of both strings and a metal tine vibrating as one unit. So this is the Confluence Harp that I built. And it doesn't have all the strings on it yet. So the idea of the Confluence Harp is taking 2 modes of vibration and having the same body kind of vibrate in these 2 different modes. The idea is that the tension of the strings will be equal to the frequency of the fixed frequency from the tine, so it will kind of sympathetically excite each other. So right now, you can just hear the fixed frequency. And all we're doing is we're picking up the microphone signal through the air, where these strings are actually, there's a pickup inside of here. And so for the performance, it will be a combination of the microphone and the pickup. So you'll hear both. And because they'll be tuned together as one object, when you strike it, you'll hear both excitations. So again, the idea of confluence and things coming together. I've always been obsessed with the way sound happens, whatever that means, electronics or acoustics or whatever. I've always thought it was really interesting. So early on, I got into building my own instruments, like synthesizer boxes and stuff like that. And I'm always thinking about building things that don't exist. Like I would never take a piece of wood and try to build a guitar. Like Sweetwater sells 1,000 guitars a day. Why do I need to build a guitar? But pushing limits and trying to figure out some new idea in music, I think is way more interesting to me. One of the reasons for making an instrument for this piece is there's a specific scale that I had a melody play down, where I did this kind of microtonal stepwise idea, descending idea, but in a traditional scale there was only 6 notes to choose from, and I had a beat of 7 notes that I needed, so I changed the interval, so there was 14 notes per octave. And so an example of that scale is right here. So what happens is you have a little less than a half step. The 14th root of 2 is not anywhere near any of these ratios that we're used to hearing or that we'd want to hear, but it really works well in this kind of descension of the scale, and I can't wait to hear other instruments in the orchestra play this.
The first rehearsal was just mind-blowing. It was a joy. It was the first time that many of the people for this collaboration were even meeting in the first place. John and Chris and I had never been in the same place at the same time, nor had we been in the same place as all the other folks from EarthQuaker and the many, many other people who it takes to bring this piece to life. We had been working through phone call and Zoom call and FaceTime on this thing that was really, really depended on really fine sound quality, which was a challenge in itself. And then it was right to work. The Confluence Harp I had never seen before, and so I spent some good time with that, just familiarizing myself with the instrument and how to create different sounds on it. And then of course, once the actual orchestra got there, there was much to be done just to find out how we can use the effects and really sort of seamlessly blend into the experience that the audience is having.
I hope that the audience just gets moved by it. It is an expression of art, and we did put a lot of heart and soul into this, and I hope people really are touched by it.
Probably that's the number one thing. It isn't really about the effects. It isn't about what an orchestra can do or what an artist working with pedals can do. It's what's the emotional experience that the artists have created with these as their resources. What magical landscape have they created using these colors? And I'm sure in the end, it will be a wonderfully uplifting and cathartic experience. I can see that just staring into the score every day. That's what it's going to be.
I hope the audience can see that the medium of orchestra music is ever evolving, and there are new things still happening in that world. Certainly collaborations like this, I think, just hit that home that the nature of making music and even making orchestral music is evolving just as we are. And there's always going to be room for something new.
I'm hoping that this expansion into electronic effects and our partnership with EarthQuaker might lead to more and more. I think that the talent is limitless. I mean, the devices themselves are incredibly varied. The artists that EarthQuaker works with, it's a huge family of folks from very different walks of life, musically speaking. Yeah, I'm hoping that this opens up a huge new wing in our architecture that we can have a whole lot of fun with down the road.
And Jake is just a master orchestrator, and you'll hear immediately what I'm saying. And so skillful in a way that he, to some degree, is able to imitate the effect through an acoustical means. So you won't always necessarily know what is processed and what is just a really cool orchestrational technique. So Confluence, it's the coming together of two organizations, a true community effort, two composers, and two entirely sound worlds presented for you for the very first time. Akron Symphony, EarthQuaker Devices, world premiere.